The dust hung in the air like a shroud over the town of Redemption Creek, turning the late afternoon sun into a hazy copper disk. Jacob Thornwood stood on the platform of the train station, his worn leather boots planted firm on weathered planks, watching as the eastbound locomotive hissed and groaned to a stop. He was a tall man, lean and hardened by years of working the land, his face creased by sun and wind into the texture of old saddle leather. At 37, he'd built his ranch from nothing, carved it out of the unforgiving Montana territory with his bare hands and stubborn will. But a ranch needed more than cattle and horses. It needed a family, and Jacob had neither wife nor child to call his own. The conductor stepped down first, then turned to assist a passenger. A woman emerged from the train car, small and slight, dressed in a simple gray traveling dress that had seen better days. She carried a single carpet bag and moved with the careful precision of someone navigating unfamiliar ground. Her hair, a mousy brown, was pulled back severely from a pale face that might have been pretty once, before life had etched worry lines around her eyes and mouth. Margaret Sullivan, 9 years old, according to the letter she'd sent in response to his advertisement. A widow, alone in the world, willing to travel west to become a rancher's wife. Jacob had paid for her passage, sent the money order east to Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, along with a brief letter outlining the terms. He'd been honest, at least, told her the ranch was isolated, the work hard, the winters brutal. Told her he needed a wife to cook and keep house, to help with the endless labor that came with running a spread of 800 acres. He hadn't mentioned that he'd been alone for so long he sometimes went days without speaking aloud, or that the silence of the ranch house had become so heavy it felt like drowning. She spotted him immediately. He was the only man waiting on the platform, and his advertisement had included a description. 6'2", dark hair graying at the temples, a scar along his left jaw from a brush with a Mustang that hadn't wanted breaking. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, not affection, not yet, but recognition, an acknowledgment of the bargain they'd struck. Jacob stepped forward, removing his hat. Mrs. Sullivan, Mr. Thornwood. Her voice was quiet but steady. Easter, educated, he could tell, refined. What was a woman like this doing answering advertisements from frontier ranchers? I trust your journey was tolerable. It was long. She looked past him, taking in the rough buildings of Redemption Creek, the rutted main street, the mountains rising purple and forbidding in the distance. He saw something flicker in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or regret. The wagon's this way. He took her bag, noting how light it was. Everything she owned in the world, carried in one small case. It's another hour to the ranch. They rode in silence, the wagon wheels creaking over the dirt road that wound through sage and scrub grass. Like walking into fog without knowing what waited on the other side, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Jacob found himself acutely aware of her presence, the rustle of her skirts, the faint scent of rose water that clung to her despite the long journey. The ranch appeared as they crested a low hill. The house was simple but solid, built of logs he'd cut and fitted himself, with a wide porch and a stone chimney. The barn stood nearby, flanked by corrals and outbuildings. Cattle dotted the pastures, red and white shapes against the golden grass. It wasn't much, but it was his, earned through blood and sweat and years of work that would have broken a lesser man. It's substantial, Margaret said, the first words she'd spoken since leaving town. It's home. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Or it will be, for you. He helped her down, his hands spanning her narrow waist, and felt her stiffen at his touch. She pulled away quickly, smoothing her skirts, her face carefully blank. Inside, the house was clean but sparse. Jacob had spent the past week scrubbing and straightening, trying to make it presentable. The main room served as kitchen and parlor both, with a table he'd built from pine, 4 chairs, a cookstove, and a pair of worn armchairs near the fireplace. 2 bedrooms opened off the main room, his and the one he'd prepared for her. Margaret set down her bag and turned to face him. In the dimmer light of the house, he could see her more clearly. She was younger than he'd expected from her letters, though her eyes held the weariness of someone who'd lived through hardship. A thin white scar ran along her right hand, disappearing into her sleeve. "Mr. Thornwood," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I believe we should speak plainly about the arrangement we've entered into." Jacob nodded, surprised by her directness. "I'd appreciate that, ma'am. You paid for my passage. You paid for me to come here and become your wife. I want you to know that I understand the bargain." She lifted her chin, meeting his eyes. "I will fulfill my obligations, all of them. I'm not a child, and I'm not naive about what marriage entails." Heat crept up Jacob's neck. He hadn't expected this conversation so soon or so bluntly. "Mrs. Sullivan, I don't, please." She held up a hand. "Let me finish. I have nowhere else to go. No family, no prospects. You offered me a life here, and I accepted. In exchange, you expect a wife. A true wife. I understand that." She paused, swallowing hard. "You paid for me. Now do it." The words hung in the air between them, stark and raw. Jacob stared at her, seeing the fear beneath her forced courage, the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled despite her steady voice. "No," he said. She blinked. What? I said no." Jacob crossed to the window, looking out at his land, the cattle grazing peacefully in the fading light. "I didn't pay for you, Mrs. Sullivan. I paid for your train ticket. There's a difference. I don't understand." He turned back to face her. "I placed that advertisement because I need help on this ranch, because the house is too quiet, and the work is too much for one person, because I'm tired of being alone." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his own inability to articulate what he felt. "But I'm not. I didn't bring you here to use you. That's not what this is." Margaret's carefully composed expression cracked, confusion and something like relief washing over her face. "Then what do you want from me?" "I want a partner, someone to share the work and the life out here. I want—" He hesitated, then pressed on. "I want what my parents had, a true marriage, built on respect and common purpose, maybe even affection in time. But you said you needed a wife. I do, but a wife is more than—" He gestured vaguely, embarrassed. "More than just those obligations you mentioned. At least, it should be." She sank into one of the chairs, her knees apparently unwilling to support her any longer. "My first husband," she said quietly, "he married me for my father's business connections. When my father died and the connections died with him, I became nothing more than an inconvenience, a burden. When he passed, I was relieved." She looked up at Jacob, tears shining in her eyes. "I thought this would be the same, a transaction. I'd prepared myself for it." Jacob pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "I'm sorry for what you endured, but this doesn't have to be that. What do you propose, then?" "Time," he said simply. "Time to know each other, to see if we can build something real. I won't." He felt his face heat again. "I won't press my attentions on you. You have your room, I have mine. When and if you decide you want more from this marriage, you'll tell me. And if I never do—" The question hit him harder than he'd expected. He'd thought about it during the long weeks waiting for her arrival, wondering what he'd do if they couldn't find common ground, if she remained forever a stranger in his house. But he'd made his choice when he sent that money order. "Then you'll still have a home here. a place that's yours. I'll not turn you out or make you miserable for failing to meet some expectation." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face. "You're a strange man, Jacob Thornwood." "So I've been told." He stood, suddenly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the conversation. "You must be tired from your journey. I'll show you to your room. There's water for washing, and I've got stew on the stove for supper. Nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up." She rose and followed him to the smaller bedroom. It was simple but comfortable, with an iron bedstead he'd bought in town, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the eastern pastures. He'd hung curtains, plain calico, and put a rag rug on the floor. A woman's room, or his best attempt at making one. "It's lovely," Margaret said softly. "Thank you." Jacob nodded and retreated, pulling the door closed behind him. He stood in the main room for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of her moving about, unpacking her meager belongings. What had he done? Brought a stranger into his home, made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But when he thought about sending her back, about returning to the crushing solitude of his life before, something in his chest tightened with protest. The first weeks were awkward, a careful dance of two people learning to exist in the same space. Margaret rose early and threw herself into the work of the household with a fierce determination. She scrubbed and swept, learned to manage the temperamental cook-stove, planted a kitchen garden in the patch of earth behind the house. Jacob watched her covertly, surprised by her strength, by the way she attacked every task as though her life depended on it. Perhaps it did, he realized. This was her proving herself, demonstrating her worth, ensuring her place here was secure. He tried to make things easier where he could. Fixed the pump so she didn't have to strain to draw water. Built a shelf in the kitchen for her spices and cooking implements. Brought her wildflowers once, left them on the table without comment, and came home that evening to find them in a jar by the window, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. They talked more as the days passed, careful conversations over supper about the weather, the cattle, the state of the crops. Gradually, the topics expanded. She told him about Philadelphia, about her father's dry goods store, about the books she'd loved as a girl. He told her about building the ranch, about the hard winter of '80, one that had nearly broken him, about his parents' farm in Ohio, and why he'd left to make his own way. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Jacob came in from the barn to find her standing in the kitchen, her hands covered in flour, tears streaming down her face. He froze, uncertain what to do. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "I can't." She gestured helplessly at the pie she'd been attempting, its crust torn and uneven. "I'm trying to make this properly, and I can't remember how my mother did it. She tried to teach me, but I never paid attention. I thought I'd have time to learn later, and then she was gone and—" Jacob crossed to her, pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, and gently wiped her face. "It's all right. It's just a pie." "It's not just a pie." The words burst from her. "I'm supposed to be a wife, a proper wife, and I can't even make a decent pie. And you've been so kind, so patient, and I'm failing at the one thing I came here to do. Hey now." He tilted her chin up, making her meet his eyes. "You're not failing. You've made this house a home in the past month. I come in from work now, and there's good food on the table, and the place is warm and welcoming, and I don't dread the silence anymore. That's not failing. You're just being kind. I'm being honest." He released her and stepped back, aware that he'd been holding her longer than was strictly proper. "And for what it's worth, my pies look even worse than that. How about we finish this one together? Between the two of us, we might manage something edible." She laughed, a surprised sound that seemed to startle even her. "You'd help me bake." Why not? I can follow instructions well enough." They worked side by side, their hands brushing as they repaired the crust, carefully filling it with the apples she'd sliced. It wasn't perfect when it went into the oven, but it was serviceable. And when they sat down to eat it after supper, warm and drizzled with cream, Jacob thought it might be the best pie he'd ever tasted. Summer deepened into fall, and the work of the ranch intensified. Hay to cut and store, cattle to move to winter pastures, fences to mend before the snow came. Margaret proved herself unexpectedly capable, helping where she could, learning to handle the horses, even assisting with the branding when Jacob's hired hands came up short. He watched her one afternoon, standing in the corral with a red, hot branding iron, her sleeves rolled up and her hair escaping its pins, and felt something shift in his chest. This was his wife, he realized, not just the woman who kept his house, but his true partner, standing shoulder to shoulder with him against the demands of this hard land. That night, after a supper eaten in comfortable silence, Margaret cleared her throat. "Jacob." He looked up from the tack he was mending. "Yes, I've been thinking." She set down her mending, her hands fidgeting with the fabric, "about our arrangement, about what you said when I first arrived." His heart began to pound, but he kept his voice level. "What about it? You said I should tell you when I wanted more from this marriage." She met his eyes, her face flushed but resolute. "I'm telling you now, if the offer still stands." Jacob carefully set aside the bridle he'd been working on. "Margaret, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. I want to." She stood, crossed to where he sat, and held out her hand. "You've shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You've made me feel valued, not just as a housekeeper or a burden you're obligated to bear, but as a person, as someone who matters. I want to be your wife in truth, Jacob, all of it, if you'll have me." He took her hand, feeling the calluses that had formed on her palm from months of hard work, the strength in her fingers. "I'll have you, Margaret Thornwood, gladly." He rose and led her to his room, to the bed he'd slept in alone for so many years. What passed between them that night was tender and unhurried, a joining that felt less like the fulfilling of an obligation and more like the natural culmination of the partnership they'd been building all along. Afterward, lying with her head on his chest, her breath warm against his skin, Jacob felt a contentment he'd never known. "I love you," he said quietly, the words surprising even himself. "I don't know when it happened, but I do." She lifted her head, her eyes shining in the moonlight filtering through the window. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just afraid to admit it, afraid it would give you power over me." "Never." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We're equals in this, Margaret. Partners, that's how it should be." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and he thought about how close he'd come to never having this. If he'd been a different man, if he'd treated her as property instead of a person, if he'd demanded rather than waited, they'd both have lost something precious. Winter came hard that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that drifted higher than the fence posts. Jacob and Margaret worked together to keep the cattle fed, to break ice from the water troughs, to ensure the horses stayed healthy in the barn. They spent long evenings by the fire, reading aloud to each other, playing cards, talking about their plans for spring. One night, with the wind howling outside and the fire crackling warm, Margaret looked up from her knitting. "Jacob, do you ever regret it, placing that advertisement, bringing me here?" He set down the account book he'd been reviewing and crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it. "Not for one moment. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Thornwood. You took a house and made it a home, took a lonely man and gave him a family. No, I don't regret it. Do you?" She set aside her knitting and cupped his face in her hands. "Never. You gave me back my life, Jacob, my dignity, my hope. I came here thinking I was bought and paid for, expecting to be treated as property. Instead, I found a partner, a friend, a love I never dreamed I could have. How could I regret that?" He kissed her then, pouring into it all the love and gratitude and wonder he felt. When they finally drew apart, she was smiling. "We should expand the house this spring," she said. "Add another bedroom." He raised an eyebrow. "Planning on taking in boarders?" She laughed, placing his hand on her still, flat stomach. "Not exactly." Understanding dawned, followed by a joy so fierce it nearly overwhelmed him. "Margaret, truly, truly, come summer, there'll be 3 of us." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling the miracle of it wash over him. From nothing, from a simple advertisement and a train ticket east, they'd built this: a marriage, a family, a future. Outside, the wind continued to rage, but inside they were warm and safe and together. The ranch would weather the winter, as it always did. And when spring came, they'd plant and build and prepare for the new life coming to join them. Together, as they did everything now. Partners, equals, beloved. The rancher had done it all right. He'd brought home a mail order bride. But what he'd found was so much more than he'd bargained for. He'd found love, and in finding it, had given it in return. And that made all the difference.